Hi, I'm Allison, and this is Nellie, and we live part-time in a tiny camper. This time, we're heading to Vancouver Island for 6 days of hiking, camping, beachcombing, berry picking, and mushroom hunting. And if you've ever had questions about traveling alone, or are just curious what kind of unhinged people I've happened upon alone in the woods, stay with me because there's no better time than a long road trip to swap some scary stories. We're starting on day 2 because we're just gonna forget day 1 even happened, alright? One of my fears as a solo traveler came true yesterday, and I just barely made it here today. The border crossing was almost instant, but then the day kinda went downhill from there. I planned to, and did to some extent, explore a few parks on the outskirts of Vancouver before hitting a city campground for the night near the ferry terminal, so we could catch the ferry first thing in the morning. But almost none of that happened because my car keys disappeared on hike number 3. It was almost impossible to find a locksmith 2 hours before the close of business the day before Canada Day, but after some slightly tearful begging, I finally did, to the tune of 950 Canadian dollars, which is more than the cost of this entire trip. But that's why we have an emergency fund, right? Let's just call that lesson number 1 I've learned in my years as a solo traveler. Have an emergency fund. It's a lot easier to get yourself out of trouble if you have money immediately available. And when you have an emergency fund, you can, say, fix a problem like losing your keys in the nick of time before it costs you the whole vacation, and without it putting you in a financial bind when you get back. Anyway, the ferry trip takes about 2.5 hours, and in my 3 trips to this island in my life, I've never known it to even be a minute late. I made reservations about 3 months in advance, and there were plenty of times open back then. It's another couple hours of driving to get to our campground for the week on the west side of the island and out of cell service range. So now that you're comfy in the passenger seat, let me tell you a slightly funnier thing that happened to me this trip. Lesson number 2 I've learned in my solo travels is to keep your head on a swivel. Always, always, always be aware of your surroundings. Now, most of the time, you're going to be pretty safe outdoors, so it can actually just be really entertaining, the kind of things you'll hear and notice with a pair of sunglasses on and one earbud in your ear. That is to say, when people don't think you are paying attention. With a bit of time to kill before check-in today, we took a quick trip along French Beach, which was pretty packed for a Tuesday. I was on my way down to the beach from the parking lot when I noticed in my peripheral vision a pair of meathead dudes coming my way. And do you ever just look at the way someone carries themselves and they just scream to you, "Don't make eye contact or I will cause you trouble of some kind"? Well, I didn't make eye contact, but as they were walking by, one bro says to the other, "Would you?" Now, I didn't hear the reply, but I can infer it because then this guy said, "Even with the hair?" And ladies and gentlemen, my hair did look terrible that day, I'll give him that. But vacation hair don't care, so I laughed about that one the rest of the way down the beach. This weekend is mostly for relaxing, so we're going to keep our hike short and sweet and not too crazy. It's also forecast to be about 20 degrees cooler here than it is back home, with some fog in the mornings and sun in the afternoon. Basically all the Pacific Northwest weather goodness this rainforest witch loves. Continuing north up the west coast of the island, we will find ourselves in Port Renfrew bright and early this morning. All this cool, gloomy island weather happens to make for a great mushroom growing environment, so this trip we also saw some pretty neat slimy stuff. While not a fungus, slime molds grow in a lot of the same environments as fungi, and in my opinion are just as interesting and sometimes photogenic. Slime molds start as a single-celled organism that joins together with other single cells to make up their fruiting bodies before they spore. And at all stages of this life, they look like they're from another planet. And well, speaking of single-celled, here's solo travel lesson number 3. Always tell someone where you're going. For long trips, find a friend willing to be your home base you can check in with at least daily if possible. I do my best to follow that rule, but sometimes I slip up. And one of those times I got very lucky. It was back in early 2020 and all the trails were closed where I lived, so I decided to just go hike logging roads instead of trails one day. I thought it was a pretty smart idea at the time. I told someone where I planned to go and headed out. Well, there were more people than I bargained for parked on that road, so I suddenly changed my plans, found what I thought would be a more secluded road, and started hiking. Barely 1 mile up the trail, a side-by-side rips around a corner and comes to a skidding halt right in front of me. He's looking around very intently, my dog goes crazy, and the hair on the back of both of our necks was standing up. And this fool asked me, "You all by yourself? Boyfriend with you or anything?" My friends, even if you don't have nefarious intentions, never ask a lone person you encounter in the middle of nowhere if they're alone. It's really creepy. And you know what? Lesson number 4 here is to lie. You always lie. You are never alone, and your boyfriend is always just up the hill taking a leak or something. So I lied, gesturing up the hill at said invisible boyfriend, and this guy says nothing and takes off up the road, up that hill I just pointed to. So I turned around and ran as fast as I could back in the direction of my car. Eventually, I hear him turn around and the engine noise getting closer to me again. I could hear it coming up behind me, so before it could come around a corner and spot me, I jumped into a ravine where I called 911 and hid for over an hour while a game warden came looking for me. And the sheriff found him hanging out and waiting at my car. And had my phone not had service, I'd have been down there in that ravine as long as it took for that creep to leave, and nobody was coming to look for me there because I had changed my plans. So I always send a text to my point person when I change my plans now. I also walk with a slight limp sometimes because I tore my Achilles jumping down that ravine. While the early morning rain might look a bit discouraging, it's pretty normal for Vancouver Island. In fact, while people tend to joke that it rains a lot in Seattle, where I'm from, it's actually areas of Vancouver Island that get the most rainfall in North America, with one area averaging 23 feet, or over 7,200 millimeters annually. Its climate and terrain and plant life make it feel a lot like home to me, so I'm not one to be rained out of a good time. But in the summer, I've found it's never too long before the sun comes back and we could leave from our campsite back down to China Beach for a hike over to Mystic Beach. It was about 6.5 miles round trip and took us about 3 hours. And now I've seen some trails, but I think this trail might win the prize for the trail with the most tripping hazards. In fact, the path is so broken by roots and other growth that you might find yourself needing the orange flags nailed to the trees about 5 feet from the ground to figure out where you're supposed to be. The suspension bridge, not far from the trailhead parking, is a nice fun break. And Nellie, while skeptical of it at first, didn't seem to mind it too much. Really though, there's a lot of routes and a lot of stairs. If there's anything you can count on at almost all of the beaches on the west side of Vancouver Island, it's gonna be stairs. All right, well, since we're going to be out here a while, it's probably a good time to have a little chat about lesson number 5 I've learned traveling solo, and that is being self-sufficient means being safe. If you can take care of your basic needs and common emergencies you encounter on the road, you'll find yourself less often at the mercy of whoever happens to stop to help. This could not have been more obvious to me than when I was driving home from Alaska a few years ago. I carried 20 gallons of extra fuel with me at all times because I knew I didn't want to risk running out of gas out there. Now, on the way up to Alaska, I didn't find I needed it, but I took a different route home. It was at least a day's drive from cell phone service, and it was late in the evening somewhere in the Yukon when I pulled into a tiny little gas station. And I just got bad vibes right away. I stopped, but I didn't get out. I looked around and saw in my rearview mirror a couple guys step out of the shade of a tree behind me. So I just drove off. And I could afford to just drive off because I had the extra fuel to get to the next gas station a few hours away. No big deal. But when I did eventually pull over to use my extra fuel, a logging truck pulled over to ask if I was okay and to warn me to not stop anywhere if I didn't have to because it was dangerous out there, he said. So then I spent the rest of the drive back sleeping in the front seat of my Jeep so I could wake up and drive away if anyone approached me at night. All that to say, your supplies can keep you safe in more ways than one. On day 5, just when I was starting to feel a bit isolated, I headed back south of my camp for the day to the East Sook Regional Park. I'm in the mood for a good cliffside hike, and Betcher Bay delivers. We did about 6 miles hugging the shoreline and tripping over more roots. The view is not only gorgeous, but it also includes home. That's Washington over there, and we're looking somewhere near Port Angeles. Okay, now I promise I'm done telling scary stories. Let's go with something a little lighter. Lesson number 6 might be a little counterintuitive, especially after the last 2 stories I just told you. But always make friends if there's an opportunity. Some of my closest friends today I've met traveling while by myself. Some of them were by themselves. You're going to find yourself around other people who like doing the things you like doing anyway, so it's a great time to make friends. And you know what? You're alone, so you can make up an excuse to talk to somebody, ask for help or advice or directions or something, even if you think you don't need it. And if you're a solo woman, you can generally strike up random conversation with folks and not risk being misinterpreted as a total weirdo. Your mileage may vary though, depending on your social skills. But don't miss out on meeting new people however you prefer to go about that. You never know, you too might just end up dancing with strangers on the roof of a van in Glacier National Park, or attending a stranger's marriage ceremony in Yosemite because the park was on fire and all their guests bailed. Almost anything can happen out there.
What are you doing? Hello. What are you doing? Are you just happy? What? What?
We had one more day left on the island before we head back on the ferry the first thing the next morning, and my legs felt in need of a bit of elevation gain. Working my way back into civilization a bit, I headed to Lake Cowichan for a 5.5-mile hike up Bald Mountain, which starts in a random suburb and climbs above the lake. Now, it's not uncommon for folks to stop and ask me to, number one, pet Nellie, and then ask some questions about how she gets around on the trails. While they're not fast hikers, basset hounds are still hounds and therefore built and programmed to be persistent in following a trail. However, they are prone to back injuries and arthritis because, well, they have a lot of spine. So for steep trails and scrambling, I carry Nellie in an emergency sling. And I do that because, well, lesson number 7 is when you're traveling solo, there's a lot less margin for error. So you kind of need to take safety precautions a little more seriously than the average bear. There used to be a time in my life where I did not carry a dog sling as part of my kit. Unfortunately, I learned the hard way just how difficult it is to carry your dog down a mountain when my dear old dog Isis tore multiple paw pads and needed such a carry. I was out in the middle of the week, so there wasn't a soul for probably 20 miles where I was. I was way on my own to carry a 60-pound dog 8 miles, and I was already carrying a backpack still packed for another 5 days of camping. So I had to fashion 2 camp towels into a giant baby sling, which worked okay, but it took us both a long time to recover from that trip. Anyway, because I'm on vacation and kind of wanted to treat myself to a hot bath and one good night of sleep, I got a hotel in Nanaimo so it would be easy to get out and about to catch the first ferry home tomorrow. I did not get that good night of sleep because it turns out that block of the city is where all the nightlife happens, but the bath was nice nonetheless. You good? Well, we made it to the end of the week with more memories and one less mailbox key. I have to figure that out. It's time to go home and go back to work. After a ferry crossing, a border crossing, and a really long nap, that is. If you're looking for a view, I have to say I prefer the outside top deck of the ferry rather than any of the indoor seating areas in the front, like the dining room. And if I ever find myself having to wait a long time for something, like a 2-hour ferry ride, that's my meditation time. Which brings us to our last lesson, number 8. Be present. And you don't have to meditate, just notice. Not everything has to be documented, not everything has to be shared. I actually keep a lot of places and adventures to myself. It's good for the soul to have unmediated, raw connection with your surroundings, not behind a lens or a phone. So a lot of weekends you don't see me are spent hiking up to high places and just sitting there still for at least an hour before I go back. It drives Nellie crazy, but I swear I can remember hikes better when I slow down to take it in with my own 2 eyes open. It drives Nellie crazy, but I swear I remember hikes better when I slow down and take it in with my own 2 eyes open and capture little to none of it on camera. Being alone is a very rare opportunity for getting some outer silence and inner silence.